under federal jurisdiction, so you're welcome. I want to start off, of course, by acknowledging that we are here on the traditional and unceded territories of the Cowichan people. People who have inhabited this land for many, many thousands of years, and we are very fortunate to have such a strong relationship with them today. So here we are again. I can remember talking about another pipeline, the Northern Gateway pipeline, a few years ago, and we have all heard about the dangers of climate change that are going on. But before I go in that, I want to recognize that there are some very special people in the room. So if I can have Gene Crowder stand up, my former boss in the department. I also want all of the candidates for municipal office to please stand up and be recognized, if any are in the room. I want to thank you for putting your names forward. It takes a lot of courage, and I know that municipal elections are very important. They're a very important partner for both the provincial and federal level of government, so thank you for putting your names forward. So back to where I was, climate change and what's going on in Ottawa. We have all seen, I think in this room we're very aware, the IPCC report that was released earlier this week. And I think I'm getting a sense that scientists are getting a little bit tired of telling policymakers that there's a problem with the world. And I think this latest report was their effort to put it in big, bold, capital letters that, you know, this is a fact, and you don't argue with the facts. They are there, they are incontrovertible, and it's up to us to assume some responsibility to actually bring forward meaningful policy that recognizes the problem and puts us on a course towards the future. And unfortunately, in Ottawa, the big debate right now is over the carbon tax. Like, we've got to have a carbon tax, no, we can't have a carbon tax. And the unfortunate thing is both sides are getting so entrenched. It's almost like a World War I battlefield. They're forming their trenches. They're just not talking to each other. They're talking at each other. And the Liberals know their targets are nowhere near where we need to be. And the Conservatives, the number of premiers that are now being elected, they have yet to respond with a credible plan of their own. And meanwhile, the science is there, outlining a very stark picture of what's going to be happening, not 100 years from now, decades from now. Talking about the year 2040, when we are going to start to see these changes really take effect. And I'm talking about increased wildfires, coastal inundation, stronger storms. And you know, I always try to put this conversation into economic terms because I feel that's what tends to reach a lot of people, because they always talk about the cost of a carbon tax, and we can't afford to do this kind of stuff because it's going to affect the middle class. Well, scientists in this report estimate that the costs of unmitigated climate change are going to hit us in the trillions of dollars. So the costs of doing nothing far outweigh any kind of investment that we put in here and now. And then bringing it back closer to home, you know, here on Vancouver Island, we are blessed to live in, I think, one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And I don't hesitate to talk to my colleagues out east that we have flowers coming up in February. But the coast very much informs, it's a part of our identity. It really is a part of who we are. And I think we, as stewards not only of the land but of the water, that's really important to us. And you know, when you look at the plans of the Kinder Morgan expansion and the number of tankers they want to increase that to. You know, earlier this year I was traveling with the Standing Committee on Agriculture. We were going across the country looking at technology and innovation in agriculture. And one of our stops was in Port Metro, Vancouver, because of course that is where the majority of our grain shipments leave the country. So the government of Canada has this really ambitious goal to increase our grain exports up to a level, well, our agricultural exports to a level of $75 billion a year by the year 2025. And most of that infrastructure to handle that is in the Burrard Inlet, the very same inlet where the Kinder Morgan, now Trans Mountain Terminus is. Now, I asked port officials, you know, what happens when a tanker is navigating those waters and trying to get under the Lions Gate Bridge. And they basically said, well, all traffic stops. And they have to navigate it very carefully through. So you think about the perfect storm. We've got two ideals colliding here. The government wants to increase tanker exports, but they also want to increase everything else. And we know around the Southern Gulf Islands, all the anchorages are being overused. It's simply not going to work. And the threat of a spill of diluted bitumen in our waters, we know the dangers with southern resident killer whales are going on. I don't want to go too much into Nathan's presentation. This is all going to be laid out in great detail. But I do want to take this opportunity to introduce Nathan. Nathan has been the elected member of Parliament for the riding of Skeena-Bulkley Valley since 2004. And that speaks a lot to the confidence the people in northwestern British Columbia put in him. And now I got to tell you that other than Gene, Nathan has always been one of my political idols because he is also a father of twins. And so I said to myself, if Nathan can do it, I think I can do it too. But he, I think a lot of people have a stereotypical view of northern British Columbia that it's just where you get your wood and get your water. It's just resource-based. And I think Nathan has always brought a different point of view from northwestern British Columbia. Very strong Indigenous representation. It's a big part of the culture there. And, in our BC caucus, I've always appreciated his voice, his experience, especially for the class of 2015. So, with all that being said, please join me in giving a very warm Cowichan Valley welcome, Nathan Cullen.
So, Gene, he says you're his mentor when he's talking to you, eh? He says I'm his mentor when he's talking to me. I guess he is, that's right. Thank you, Alistair, for that introduction. Thank you for the welcome. How's everyone doing on this beautiful Friday evening? You guys know how to show up. I want you all to understand that you are a very elite group of Canadians. Because right now you are missing hundreds of hours of Netflix that you could be catching up on. And even while we're sitting here over the next hour or so, they're going to produce thousands of hours of more shows that you're going to have to then get at. Thank you for choosing to be involved in your community rather than be distracted by those very tempting distractions that are out there. We're going to talk about this. We're going to tell some stories. I should clarify first, because we are in a recreation facility and this happens inevitably. If anyone's here for the Zumba class, it's actually downstairs and to the left. We're all good? Okay. A lot of times when I clarify where people are actually, there's a few that get up and leave. I want to start us off with you all talking to each other for a moment. This is something that we do from time to time in the Northwest to get to start a conversation. And I've stolen this from some Gig Sam friends of mine who started their meeting this way. And so we're going to do it here. And it might get a little noisy. So what you need to do is not be in large groups and sit close to each other as we do this. It's very simple. All I want you to do is just in groups of like a couple, 3 people max sort of thing, you're going to tell each other your names. But I want you to tell each other your full name. And if you know where your name comes from and what it means. So there's enough of you looking confused, so let me demonstrate. My full name is Nathan Paul Cullen. Cullen I get from my mother's side. We're County Kildare Irish. And I was first born of my mom's family in Canada. They immigrated in the 60s. Paul is my middle name because I was raised Irish Catholic, and you get a saint thrown in for good luck, I think. Nathan I actually get from my father's side. My father's grandfather, whose name is Nathan Weintraub II. They were Russian Orthodox Jewish. And so with a different course of events in the early 70s, it worked out another way. I would be Nathan Weintraub III, which I sometimes wonder what life would look like that kind of a handle. I think quite interesting is my guess. Mom says, you know, Irish Catholic, Orthodox, Russian Jew. I was political before I was born. And that was true, according to my grandmother. That's my name, that's where I come from. In the Irish tradition, we sometimes name our kids after those that went before, as a way to honor. That's why I got Nathan as my name. You'll have only 5 minutes. There'll be groups no smaller than 2, no bigger than 3. I'll let you work out the math. Joe and Nancy, I'm splitting you up. And listen to what people have to say, and I'll call you back in a couple minutes. 5 minutes. Go. How was that? Great, good, interesting, great. Why? Diverse? What kinds of things were you hearing as people talk about their names? Hardly anybody came from here? Okay. What else did people hear as people were talking about their names? People from away. What else? Family tradition. Okay. What else? Some people change their names. Names are not always a fixed thing. They change over time. Yeah? Anything else? What kinds of things did you hear in people's names? Yeah. Immigration. People hear a lot of immigration stories in names. Okay. Anything else? Political in the names, huh? Oh, yeah. Okay, let me ask this. When you were the one listening, you weren't talking, to be honest, were you paying attention? Yes. Oh, of course. What? Anyone texting, tweeting while folks are talking? Why were you paying attention? Stories? What do you mean? Sorry. What do you mean stories?
People's lives.
Yeah, hearing about people's lives. Hearing about stories. Okay. And why did hearing those things make you pay attention? Because they're interesting.
And we're Canadian. Respectful.
We're Canadian. Oh. And we're respectful. Oh, sorry. I didn't assume otherwise. Let me apologize. I remember coming back from, I worked in South America for years, and I was on the subway in Toronto with a big backpack. And the subway suddenly stopped, and I didn't have my hand on the bar. And so I ended up stumbling down and crashing into this woman, full on. And before I could say anything, what did she say? Sorry. And I turned to her and I said, could you give me a second? It's my fault. Okay, so when you were talking, were people listening to you? Did you feel like you were being listened to? How do we normally do this? If I just said, okay, everybody, at your table, just introduce yourselves. What do we normally offer up? Name? Name, rank, serial number? For those with a military background? Sure. What do we learn from name and maybe profession? Not a lot. So, when we have meetings up and around Hazelton, Kispiox, Kitsad meetings, we always start with this exercise, and I asked why once. And one of the elders said, well, if I don't know who I'm talking to and I don't know where they come from, how can we have a conversation? What we're talking about here tonight is a story. This is just a story. And we often treat stories like they're just for little kids, right? That's how we talk about stories, that they're just little things that we offer up young people. But I'd argue that we're all stories. Tom King, everyone read ever Tom King? The Dead Dog Cafe? Wait for the signs. He says the truth about stories is that's all we are. We all walked in here tonight with your own individual story about who you are, who this community is, and what this country is. And I think what's going on here is challenging that story for some people. And to have your stories challenged is okay too. Because stories are not fixed in granite most of the time. Most of the time. Okay, let's crack it out. In order to get to what we're going to talk about, we're going to go backwards a little bit in time. As Alistair mentioned, the first time we dealt with a major pipeline proposal in British Columbia was a pipeline called the Northern Gateway Pipeline. And for those of us living in the Northwest, this was a big issue for over a decade. A pipeline crossing from Runheim, Alberta, across the Rockies, coastal mountain ranges, and into Kitimat. Then to sail down the Douglas Channel, which is down here, and then out through the Hecate Strait, around Cowichan. That was the proposal. Diluted bitumen. 2 pipelines, a condensate pipeline in, and a diluted bitumen pipeline out. Everyone know what diluted bitumen is? Diluted, what is bitumen? Tar, right? It comes out of northern Alberta, it's melted, it's mined, taken out, but you can't get it through a pipeline. You have to dilute it because it's too thick. Do you know what the first proposal back in the 50s to extract bitumen out of Alberta was from the federal government? Does anyone know what it was? How we were going to get that tar out? Blasted with what? Nuclear. The original idea was to drill a hole down 200, 250 feet, drop a small nuclear bomb, melt the jar into more of a liquid, and then extract it that way. What was the problem with that genius plan? What couldn't they figure out how to solve? 10,000-year half-life of radioactive gasoline in your car. They couldn't quite, but that's, we really looked hard at that as a federal government. And we spent money on it. We spent money on lots of things, I guess. So that was the proposal. And it was proposed way back, mid-2000s. The very first meeting I had with Enbridge, which was the company, they're the guys that just had their gas pipeline blow up just over here, one of their lines. The first meeting, they said, can you come to a meeting? I said, sure. We're in a big office tower in Vancouver. And I hadn't quite sat down yet. I was halfway down to this chair, and they said, we've raised $100 million, Mr. Cullen. And I was kind of hovering. And I said, oh, good, wow, good for you. What's it for? And they said, it's promotion. We raised from 10 companies, upstream, downstream, $10 million each, like a poker game, to promote the pipeline. And I said, really? Like for commercials and cocktails for politicians and all that? Yeah. And I said, well, that's clearly the largest promotional budget in Canadian history. And they spent it. They spent a lot. And I asked, of course, who are the 10 players at your poker game? They said, we can't tell you that. That would be confidential information. Okay, so it was approved in 2014 by the National Energy Board. Everyone familiar with the National Energy Board? Yeah. I'm going to one day be in a room of people who like the National Energy Board. Because whether I'm with citizens, environmentalists, or industry, it's hard. There's not a lot of love out there for the NEB. 1,200 kilometers long, 500,000 barrels a day of liquid bitumen, 2 mountain ranges, a little close to 700 fish-bearing rivers and streams. Terminal in Kitimat, 220 super tankers down the Douglas Channel, 3 90-degree turns to get out to the Hecate Strait. The second windiest and waviest strait in the world. That was the proposal, and then off to China. Now, in that campaign, it was a very divisive campaign at first, but over time became a unifying campaign between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, between lefties and righties, and between rural and urban folks, where the questions being asked of us and the risks being proposed to us threatened some fundamental things about who we were as Northwesterners. Now, I should say first, the riding I represent, Skeena, Bulkley Valley, is about a third of British Columbia. It's 330,000 square kilometers in size, making it just a little bit bigger than Poland, for those who are cartographers. And at one point in the campaign, the very first meeting Enbridge had with, they invited a bunch of chiefs up to Terrace. First Nations said, come to a meeting and meet with us. And they opened with a joke. Always a good idea. And they said, chiefs, the only real question for you is, what color truck do you want? And then it went down from there. Because trinkets and beads is so 1700s. But for some, it still exists. And at one point in the campaign, and I remember the day well, in an open letter to Canadians, the federal government, my government, said those people that oppose this pipeline are foreign-funded radicals and enemies of the state. What kind of effect do you think that language had on people up north? What kind of reaction do you think proud Northerners would have to their government calling them? It galvanized. It had the opposite effect of, think of what this was the Harper government at the time, they were trying to do. And we had been through the NEB process. I was an intervener. And my central question is somebody, when you're an intervener, you get to ask the company and the government questions. And my central question was, does diluted bitumen sink or does it float in salt or fresh water? Why was that an important question to ask? About cleanup, right? If something sinks in water, cleaning it up is almost impossible. If it floats, even when things float, like oil, the global standard for a successful oil recovery operation is 8% recovery on floating oil. That's considered good. That means 90% is out. Diluted bitumen will sink if it weathers. Weathers means that it is exposed to wind or sun. It's rare up north that we don't have at least one of those going on, if not sometimes both. And we couldn't get the government or the proponent to answer that question. And people started to get suspicious. What do you mean you can't answer whether it sinks or floats? Take a jar of it, chuck it in water, and tell us what happens. And they wouldn't answer a straight question. And we also saw the NEB, National Energy Board, it's a panel of 3 people in action. And there it's a strange organism to watch up close. And they have weird rules. One of the rules was no singing. There was a rule, which you wouldn't think for most people would be a problem, but 1,100 Northerners came to testify. When you testify, you get 10 minutes to tell the truth. And the NEB was on Haida Gwaii about this project, and 10 Haida kids came forward to testify, and they said, well, we've written a song in Haida. And they were in their regalia, and they came, and they started to sing, and the NEB turned their microphone off. Now, I was in part raised by an Irish grandmother, and she had a way of just looking at me across the room to let me know exactly what was going to happen next. And we looked at the back of the room, and there were 8 Haida grannies who gave the National Energy Board a look, and they turned the microphones back on so the kids could sing. And a month later, they were in Smithers, the town I live in, and people were, and it's kind of intimidating to testify because you sit in a little chair or desk, and the NEB's there with the flags and the recorders, and the crowd is out there watching. And there was a woman, a friend of a friend, who was had her 10 minutes, and she wasn't sure what to say, and they're a big fishing family, the Howards. And the night before she's got her spot, she's sitting at home and she's totally stumped. How does she talk about these rivers and what they mean to her and her family? And her husband's watching the hockey game in the next room. And a light bulb goes off. She knows exactly what she's going to say. So she goes the next morning, she's got her 10-minute spot, and she says, I wasn't sure what to say today, and then I realized it's all in a song. And she stood up and she started to sing "O Canada." And they turned her microphone off. No singing. And she was stuck. This is all she had. So she sat down and she said, well, can I say the words? And they said, sure. So she recited "O Canada." And when she was finished, she said, there's only one thing that's repeated in the song, and it's repeated 3 times. We stand on guard for thee. She said, it's not a fluke. It's not a suggestion, it's an instruction. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm opposing this. I'm doing what the song says. And then in the back of the room, 3 guys stood up and started to sing "O Canada." And the whole room got up and sang "O Canada." The NEB didn't know what to do, so they stood up too and they sang "O Canada" together. We don't have enough patriotic moments in this country outside of hockey games. We had one there. And I thought it was quite beautiful. And in the end, they left. And in the end, they lost their court cases. In the end, they didn't gain the so-called social license to operate. And in the end, the government failed to do its primary duty, which is to operate on behalf of the country, as opposed to some special interests. It ended up unifying us in ways I couldn't thought imaginable. So now we move ahead. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, formerly known as the Kinder Morgan Pipeline. It no longer is, because Kinder Morgan sold the pipeline to us. And I have misnamed these meetings. I was saying this to Gene earlier. This is a shareholder meeting. The government didn't call one, so we're calling one tonight. Because we're all shareholders. Someone told me we each own approximately 3.2 centimeters of the pipeline now. But no one called one of these shareholder meetings before the government decided to buy this thing. This 65-year-old pipeline that's been operating since the 50s. They didn't ask you for your opinion. They didn't certainly campaign on it. And I don't think this was Trudeau's plan in 2015 when he was running for office, when he stood in British Columbia and was asked. Stephen Harper broke the review process. Will you fix it? And he said yes. And then it was asked, will you apply it to this pipeline expansion? And he said yes. And then he didn't. Understand that the review that this has been going through is the exact review that we went through under Harper's rules that were changed in an omnibus bill called C-38, which gutted the Environmental Protection Act, the Navigable Waters Act, and greatly diminished public participation in these decisions. So the new line, the proposed line, goes over much the same territory until you get down to Burnaby, and then it takes a dogleg right and goes through Burnaby Mountain. That part is new in terms of the track. 300,000 barrels a day historically could go up to 900,000 barrels a day, increasing tanker traffic and Aframax tankers through Port of Vancouver out of Burnaby by 700%. Require dredging under both bridges in order to fit. This is the biggest tanker you can fit into that harbor, and they're massive. For those who have never stood by or on one of these tankers, Aframax are about the third or fourth largest in the world. The other ones you simply can't fit. If you could, they would bring that in too. And this is where it sails. It would come out of Burnaby, down through the Strait of Georgia, through the Salish Sea, by Victoria, and then out. The tankers that are moving out right now, 34 out of 35 on average over the last 5 years that they've been moving diluted bitumen, have been going to the States. Let me repeat that. Of the 300,000 barrels a day, 34 out of 35 have been going to San Diego and the southern Gulf Coast. So one myth we have to get rid of is this is all about getting oil to China. And if only we could do that, then we would lose the price gap between what the world pays and what Canadians sell for. Two myths. One is Canadian bitumen oil is 30% more expensive to process than lighter oils. You have to work at it. It's much more energy intensive. Second, if we were trying to get to China, if that was all this was about, then why would we already be sailing to China? Why are we going to San Diego? Why are we going to Texas? And we've asked the government that we now own the pipeline, we've asked them for their contracts for where all this new oil is going to be sold to China or Korea or Japan, and they said they can't tell us that. They're confidential. And I think they don't have them. So, 408 tankers shooting the Salish Sea. City of Vancouver did a study and found that it's an 87% chance of a major oil spill over the 50-year lifetime of this pipeline. A major oil spill, standard they're talking about, would cost us about $10 billion in cleanup. And diluted bitumen does in fact sink. Here's a funny thing about Canadian law. When the oil is in the pipeline, it's federal. When it goes into the tanker, it's federal. If it spills out onto the ocean, it's federal. If it washes up onto the beach, it's provincial. Hence, this province, this government, this premier has said, we want in on this conversation because we are liable for what will happen if there's an accident. And the federal government has said it's none of your business. To this point. Federal Superior Court, a little while ago, threw out the permits that had been granted to this pipeline on two things. You remember what they were? What were the main two problems with the permits? Consultation with Indigenous people. What was the other one? The tankers. So what the NEB said was, we're not going to factor in any of the risks that happen once the oil gets into the tankers. We're going to pretend as if it doesn't go anywhere. We're going to study just the pipeline. And we will recommend just on the pipeline. And the federal court said, that's crazy. Because of course, the tankers are part of the decision. On the Indigenous consultation, the court said, and I'll read these quotes because I think they're kind of insightful. Canada was obliged to do more than passively hear and receive the real concerns of Indigenous applicants, and, quote, missing was a genuine and sustained effort to pursue meaningful two-way dialogue. What's the court saying? They didn't listen. They took notes. They went around. This was the piece that Trudeau added on to the consultation called Stage 3. This is what the court threw out. And they hired 3 people and they went in a minivan and they drove up the pipeline route, meeting with Indigenous communities. And we knew at the time it was going to fail because we were hearing from Indigenous communities saying, they phoned us this morning and said they're here for their consultation and we should gather the community. They didn't tell us they were coming. They were here for an hour and a half, and then they left. Do you call that meaningful consultation? No. And the federal cabinet took the recommendation from the NEB, with excluding the tankers, seeing what the consultation was, and stamped yes on the permits. Short exposure to bitumen has a 50% mortality on salmon. Short, non-sustained exposure to bitumen will kill half the salmon. This is one of the few studies we have on this. Salmon are not exactly overly abundant right now in British Columbia. We have all kinds of salmon problems. Adding more problems doesn't make any sense. The NEB, Indigenous communities for early on were saying they felt the process was great. Section 35 of our Constitution says you have to consult meaningfully. And the Prime Minister has said over and over again, and I will quote him, "No relationship is more important to our government and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. Today we affirm our government's commitment to a renewed nation-to-nation relationship." That was on National Aboriginal Day. Yes, he has a sense of irony. Anyone familiar with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? One of our colleagues, Romeo Saganash, Northern Quebec Cree, an MP, an interesting circle of life, worked on the UN Declaration in its writing 30 years ago. Becomes an MP. 30 years later, introduces a bill in Parliament to make the UN Declaration law in Canada for free, prior, and informed consent. And to their credit, the Liberals voted for it. And we passed the law. 6 days later, we had a vote in Parliament to say that that declaration, those rights, should apply to the Kinder Morgan expansion project. And the same MPs that voted for it voted against it 6 days later. They voted for the UN Declaration in theory, but not in practice. And I don't care about theory. I care about practice. I want to know how you are on the ground. That's where I come from. Don't tell me, show me. And they showed that they didn't want the UN Declaration to apply. Greenhouse gases. They're a problem, apparently. Who knew? Well, we knew. Canada, I was at the Paris climate talks. I was there when Canada stood up on the world stage and said 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to be our commitment. And we all celebrated. The world said Canada is back. Well, we said Canada is back. And we looked great. We were a good-looking delegation. Trudeau was smoking. He had the UN socks on. Everyone was fawning. It was an awesome time to walk around the UN as a Canadian. And the next morning after we made the commitment, we have a meeting with the Canadian delegation. And our negotiators were there, and I said, "Congratulations, you guys just did a big throw. That's a big commitment. First question, what does it mean for Canada? What do we have to do to meet that obligation?" And they said, "We haven't done that calculation yet." I got a little worried. And I said, "Okay. Second question, what kind of impact economically does such a large commitment have for Canada? Pro and con." And they said, "We're working on that." And I had a flashback to Kyoto. Anyone remember Kyoto? We went to Japan, World Climate Talks, made a big promise, and then did buckus, I think is the technical term. And then years later, the auditor reports come out, as they've now come out, saying Canada's not doing enough. The UN report that Alistair referred to says we have to cut emissions in half in a dozen years in order to meet Canada's obligations. And we're below our target. Know what who came up with Canada's target, by the way? The one that Trudeau committed to in Paris? Harvard did. Which the Liberals at that point called a floor, not a ceiling. It is still our target. That's the one that we're not meeting. It's not some new ambitious one, it's the old one from before. And that's just true. I wonder if we could do this. I'm going to try to experiment with y'all. I don't know if there's internet on this thing. We're about to find out. No? Okay. So you just imagine a really awesome graphic happening right now. Lots of spectacular video, but here's how I'll read these for you. These are temperature anomalies since the 1880s, collected by NASA through all sorts of fancy NASA tricks. These are anomalies. When the big blue dots, that means it's an anomaly, you're cold. 2 degrees or more. 1904, 1917, 07, 08, 1909. Those are the anomaly cool years. Here are the anomaly warm years. 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 2018 is on track to be another anomaly record year. The predictions that we have, I want to challenge Alistair a bit on this, is they're actually rolling them forward from what they predicted in the 90s. That the intense forest fires, the more intense hurricanes, the severe droughts, the more aggressive anomalies would come by the 30s and 40s, and they're happening now. And we had a lot of fires in BC in the last couple of years. And in my region, we had devastating fires just this past summer. And I was sitting with some of the older guys on the fire crews, guys that have been at it 30 to 35 years. And talking to them was breathtaking. Because what they said was, fires aren't acting the way they used to act. Up north, we have a lot of aspen stands mixed in, and the firefighters count on aspen because they're kind of like a buffer. They don't burn the same way. And so when they're planning out their fire strategy, and they see an aspen stand on the map, they say, all right, we've got a buffer. And this year, the fires went right through everything. And they dig pits, looking for moisture to know how intense the fire is going to be into the ground. And they were going down 1.5 meters in coastal British Columbia before they hit moisture. And one firefighter came out of the bush in Burns Lake and he said, we just did all the readings on the trees, we sampled trees. And he said, if you walk into the Safeway and get a box of matches, there's more moisture in those matches than there are in the trees right now. This is not normal. This is not what we normally see. And this is worrisome because we don't know how to fight these kinds of fires. They happen faster and they're more intense. And that fellow down in the White House calls it a hoax. But I don't know if the folks in Florida, South Carolina, and other places feel like a storm front that they've never seen before is a hoax. Here's a fun little graph or cartoon. It's settled. We agree to sign a pledge to hold another meeting. Consider changing course at a date yet to be determined. You walk around the UN sometimes. You listen to the world leaders sometimes. They act as if we have time on our side. That delay is a good strategy. When it's not a good strategy, it gets more expensive the longer we go. Okay. This is irony abounds in the oil sector. Anyone see this article from a few weeks ago? It says, Big Oil asks government to protect Texas facilities from climate change. It's not fake news. It's not like the Onion or a joke article. This is legit. They're appealing to Washington for public money to raise up the barriers around the southern Gulf Coast to make sure that the oil refineries aren't underwater. With a straight face. And seeing as who's in the White House right now, I think they'll probably get the money. Without any sense of contradiction at all. The estimates are not good for our province in particular. And we have to account for this stuff. Whatever addition, whether it's Trans Mountain, it's LNG, new cars on the road, whatever addition we're putting in, we are now under a budget, like a family is under a budget. And if you want to go out and buy some new shoes, you got to tell me where it's coming from. You want to go put more fossil fuels out of the ground, you got to tell me how we're going to pay for it. And every government at every level has to account for it. So we went out and bought the pipeline for $4.5 billion. Kinder Morgan would like to thank you because that Texas-based, do you know where Kinder and Morgan came from? Do you know there are two guys named Kinder and Morgan? Do you know who they worked for before they formed this company? Enron. We remember Enron, don't we? It wasn't so long ago, was it? One of the greatest shysters in modern corporate history. Well, they got out just before the cops came, and they formed an energy company together, and sold a 65-year-old pipeline for $4.5 billion, made $1.2 billion profit off the sale, and gave themselves $1.5 million in executive bonuses. And then we hired back the management team to run the expansion plans. And I'm not kidding. They, just by coincidence, voted the same day, within minutes of the federal court ruling. The federal court came out, tore up the permits. Kinder Morgan shareholders voted to approve the sale minutes later. 99.5% 7% approval. And I want to meet the guy who stood up at that meeting and said, I think we can get more out of them. I'm voting against. And here's what's an amazing thing. When we looked at the contract, which we got after the fact, there's a line in the contract that says, and I'm not kidding, if the permits are squashed by the courts, Canada still owns the pipeline. Imagine buying a house. Well, what condition do we normally put on buying a house if you were to go get one and done?
It has to be sound.
It has to be sound. I want to buy your house on condition of an inspection. Imagine saying, I will buy your house, and if the inspection comes back negative, I am still going to buy your house. That's what we did. That's exactly what we did. Kinder Morgan insisted on that clause, and we agreed that if the permits became worthless, we're still going to pay for it. I can't tell you how frustrating that is. To build a new expansion, that's just for the old stuff, right? To build a new one is around $10 billion, and the price is going up. The government keeps throwing around a $7 billion figure. Kinder Morgan told them back in the spring it was closer to 10. And industry is telling us it'll be even more than that, somewhere closer to 15. Now, the question to be raised is what do we risk? Nearly 130,000 jobs connected in British Columbia alone to tourism. And if you had $15 billion to spend, what would you spend it on?
Renewable energy.
That would be a good one. Housing would be a good one. Anyone having housing problems in British Columbia? Any Indigenous peoples having drinking water problems in this country? That for parts of the money that the government is now planning to spend on this, we could do so much. And I think if you did hold a Canadian shareholder meeting, I'm not sure where a diluted bitumen pipeline to Burnaby would fit on our priority list. I would argue fairly low down. That's my argument. Because no one else wanted to buy the old pipeline, and no one else wanted to buy the permits. In business, they call this a desperate buyer, desperate seller situation. Someone rolls into Duncan and says, I need to buy a house, and I need it in the next hour. They're probably not going to get the best deal. Similar to somebody saying, I need to sell my house today. Probably not going to get the best price. Canada, in this situation, is a desperate buyer, and we will be a desperate seller. That is the conditions that we have found ourselves in. So what we're doing with this, the petitions you see on your tables, is I've got this goal. Because in politics, I believe in show, don't tell. The goal is this. In the next 100 days, we're planning to gather 100,000 signatures from British Columbia and across the country to stop this from happening. To stop the government, who are in a hole right now of their own making, stop them digging further. Because the course they're on right now is that they want to go out and they plan to spend $10 to $15 billion more of our money on this. And we need to stop them. Let them catch their breath and figure out what better ways we could have of building the country. Would that be a worthwhile exercise? The other week, just 3 weekends ago now, I was in a place called Whitsett. It used to be called Morristown. Wet'suwet'en village up near Smithers. And I was there for a memorial for a fellow named Henry Alford, 83 years old. Chief Wataget was his name, is his name. And Henry was the last elder, the last chief who argued in front of the Supreme Court a case called the Delgamuukw case. Delgamuukw-Gisdaywa. And the reason Delgamuukw-Gisdaywa was so important in law is it established at the Supreme Court that oral testimony on Indigenous rights and title was valid. Because up until then, unless it was written down, territorial claims had no bearing in court. They were just stories. They were just stories. And what do you do with an oral tradition when you're sitting in front of court and the judge says, can you tell me when it was written down, your territorial claim? When Henry was young, they knew he would be getting a name, Wataget. And the current Wataget took him up into the hills outside of Smithers in Wellesley Valley. And the senior Wataget pointed at all the mountain tops and the rivers and named them all. All those sorts of names. He said, this is the territory that this name represents. And he went over them one by one. And Henry had to learn them. 30 years later, he was on the stand of the Supreme Court of Canada, and all the government of Canada had to do was find him wrong once on one of the names. Get him to make a mistake, get him to say a name wrong, misplace the name on the river or the mountaintop, and for 9 days he was cross-examined by Crown lawyers and never once incorrectly named a peak, a river, or a valley on the territory, thereby establishing that oral history was valid in Canada. Names that he had heard 30 years prior. That was Henry's responsibility. That was his contribution and his effort to establish something that was true. We all have to think about what our effort is. Because the name of this tour that I'm on is kind of depressing, isn't it? Save our coast again. It's exhausting. I don't want to fight these fights anymore. I want to fight for stuff. I want to fight for the proper housing, for green energy, for jobs that sustain over time. Things that don't raise our sea levels and burn down our communities. I want to fight for those things. But these threats keep coming again and again. And there's a natural human reaction to want to just step back and say, I'm done, I've done my time. This is somebody else's responsibility. Henry stood on the stands of the Supreme Court, and day after day, proved something to be true. That oral history matters, that it can be relied upon, and that his responsibility was fulfilled. And cases that have followed since have relied upon that effort, that contribution. So, I'm kind of hopeful about this. My grandmother, Irish, used to say, never waste a good crisis. You know, being Irish, they had a lot of experience, I guess, with crises. And she felt that really in our lives, change often was preceded by a crisis. Yeah, change. Let's do one last little exercise. Some of you who have been with me have done this many times, but play along. You need your arms for this. Gene is already way ahead. You need to just simply fold your arms, please. Cross your arms as you do. Don't interfere with somebody else's arms, sir. Good. Now look at your arms, not your neighbor's, and see which one is over top and which arm is underneath. Everyone got that? No, really, don't look at your neighbors. It'll confuse you. Okay, good. Drop your arms, please. You can let that go. I'd like you to cross your arms again, please, but opposite. Don't panic. Just work through the steps. Some of us are going to need a little more time. Okay, great. Drop that. That was excellent. Do it that way one more time again. You're the odd way. Last time. Good. Okay. Drop. The very first time I asked you to fold your arms, cross your arms, what went through your mind? Not much? If we were doing a brain activity monitor across the room, not a lot of spikes. How does it feel? The normal way, your normal way. How does it physically feel? Comfortable? Yeah? Normal? Okay. When I asked you to cross them the weird way, what was going on? Anything going on in your minds? Oh yeah. We were measuring and it went up. Volume went up. People started talking and figuring things out. How does it physically feel to have the opposite? Weird. Anybody feel normal both ways? There's always one or two. There you are. It's all normal. When I ask you to do it the second time, anything different?
Start talking to myself and telling me it's okay.
You started self-talk? It's going to be okay? That's good. There was a UCLA study at the psych department. They brought in a bunch of undergrads, paid them $20, and for 2 hours, they had them fold and unfold their arms. This way, that way, this way, that way. What did the researchers learn? They could be trained. What kind of results came out the other end? What kinds of things did the students?
It got easier.
It got easier?
The students will do anything for $20.
Students will do anything for $20? Yeah, that's often been proven at psych labs and universities.
I would say that the students are starting to study the instructor.
The students started to worry about the instructor. 85% of the students left that experiment unable to remember what their original way was. Couldn't tell. And you might say, nah, I know what's comfortable. I know what my tradition is. I know what feels right. Give me another couple hours, which we're not going to do, and I can get most of you unsure of what your natural way is. What does this tell us about the process of change? Difficult? Uncomfortable? People sometimes don't like it?
Possible.
Possible. How is it possible? Repetition? Anything else? Not really. Repetition in time, right? Say that again. In a group doesn't hurt either, right? So we've noticed in the north, when this was all going on with us with this pipeline, the strongest argument that the proponents used, the government used, was inevitability. This is inevitable. This is how it always is. That's the story. It's government. They get what they want. It's industry. It's the biggest industry. They get what they want. They're already building the pipeline, even. I heard. This thing is inevitable. We should just cut a deal. There was a plebiscite in the town of Kidnap. I think one of the first towns in Canadian history to hold a vote on a big industrial project in Kidnap. Anyone ever been to Kidnap? It's an industrial town. And so they had a vote. Should we support it or not? And Kidnap has two communities. There's Kidnap and there's Kidnap Village. The Heisel Village. The Heisel Village was not permitted to vote. It was a town vote. And we were door knocking and talking to people, and I remember one door distinctly coming out the door, and a woman came up, and I said, so there's this pipeline vote, what do you think? And she said, no, I hate it. We fish. I think that thing's going to leak, and it's going to be a disaster. And we said, oh, okay, how are you voting? She said, I'm going to go for it. We stopped, and we said, why? She says, because it's going to happen anyways. It's inevitable. And we gathered together the night of the vote, around the cenotaph in Kidnap. And the Heisel came over from Heisel Village and brought a bunch of singers, and we were going to hear the results. And they came from 3 polling stations. And we had somebody on the inside of each one to phone us with the results. And the first station phoned back and they said it's 53-47 opposed. And so I had the bullhorn and I read it out to the crowd, and everybody drummed and went, whoa, yay, but a little nervous. And the second poll came in. 51-49 in favor. Oh, God. I've never been more nervous in my life. Even my own elections, I was not this nervous. And they drummed a little bit. There was this truck came by with a couple good old boys in it. And they leaned out the window and they said, hippies, Indians. And they burned up the highway. And everybody watched them go. And after the second vote, they came by again. Hippies, Indians. They burned up the highway again. I don't know exactly what they were trying to prove, but they were consistent. And the third vote comes in, and it's the biggest poll, and this is it. This one's going to decide, and it comes in, and it's 57. 43 opposed. We won the plebiscite. Kidnap has voted against this project. And the drummers drummed, and the people cheered, and the truck came by. And went, hippies! Indians! And in unison, 6 of the biggest Heisler guys I've ever seen turned to the truck and said, hoo-ah! And the 4x kind of crept up the hill in a slow way. And there was a moment where we all stood around and kind of looked at each other, and people sang songs, and we talked about change. Because that vote 20 years ago was unimaginable. No way. Even 10. But people start thinking different about things if you're willing to talk to them about things that they care about. And I'm going to bet some of you in the next day or two are going to have a little subversive moment. You're going to be standing and waiting for the bus or at the doctor's or something, and you're going to fold your arms. And then you're going to fold them the other way. No one but you is going to know what's going on. And you're going to look at such a flexible and change-open person. This is ultimately our decision. When I say our Prime Minister and our government made this decision, I mean it. That's my voice. That's my government. Don't always agree with me, but they're my voice. And I want them to do the right thing. I want them to think not about the next election, not about the next 4 years, but about the next 40 years, the next 400 years. And this, under that context, makes no sense. Years ago, I was in Heisler, the village. I had a friend, her kid was getting a name. And when the Heisler gave names, they had that feast hall. And at one point, one of the elders got up on the stage, and he started talking in Heisler, old guy. And as he's talking, people start coming from out of the crowd, and they just stand behind him, quiet, just standing there. And he's going on. It's a long story he's telling, and I don't know Heisler. So I leaned to my friend and said, "What's going on? Where are all these people?" Because by the end, there was like 150 people standing behind him. She said, "Oh, this is a really old thing of ours. Because this is our parliament. The feast hall is our parliament. We make laws, we make peace, we make war here. And he's the head of our house. And what people are doing when they stand there is they're saying with their bodies, when he speaks, it's as if I have spoken. When he makes a promise, I have made that promise. He speaks for us." And I'm sitting in the bleachers in Kitimat Village thinking, imagine if Parliament looked this way. Imagine if every time a parliamentarian stood up, Parl, to speak, and said, "I speak now on behalf of the people I represent," and really did their best to speak on behalf of not their party, not the Prime Minister's office, but the people they're trying their best to represent. Question period would look a lot different, wouldn't it? The speeches wouldn't be typed out by some staffer, but they would come from here maybe more often. And I think we got to call our politicians, often a dirty word, up to a higher level. Ask them to be leaders. It's not just a petition. It's not just a tour. This is about big stuff. What your expectation is of the people who seek to lead us, speak for us, make decisions for us. So that's all government is. The stuff we do together that we can't do alone. Right? Housing, policing, healthcare. Stuff we do together we can't do alone. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. How are we for 5 minutes, 10 minutes of questions? Is that good? People okay for the next 5-10 minutes? I'll try to keep it tight. We'll go rapid fire as we can. Yes?
I have a question. The Supreme Court the other day said that the government doesn't have to consult.
Right. Yes. So a Supreme Court decision came out just this week that said, I'll just repeat the question, so we'll go faster. That the government was not obliged to consult with Indigenous people before introducing laws. Even laws that affect only Indigenous people. The court gave a very narrow interpretation of one case. And I think they're wrong, actually. It just seems strange to me that if you're going to bring in a law on Indigenous water on reserve, that you wouldn't be obliged to consult with the people who are going to be affected by that law. It makes no sense to me. The court gave a very technical ruling as to the obligation of government, The government under the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is obliged to do it, which they voted for. So let's find out whether they're going to do the theory or the practice on this one. But it is, the court was correct, of course, I'm not a Supreme Court justice nor a lawyer, correct in its interpretation, but narrowly focused and not where I think the government needs to go in terms of reconciliation, whatever that means on any given day. Yeah?
If the Supreme Court can't send permits because of lack of consultation, they were saying it's going to happen anyway.
Oh, yeah. Right. So the question is, the Trudeau has promised meaningful consultation, right? One of the questions we had for the government was, how meaningful can it possibly be if you've already made up your mind? I could try this if I went home and said, we're going to buy a truck to my wife, Diana, and then said, but I'm here to meaningfully consult with you first. But we're buying a truck, so what color do you think would be a good idea? How well do you think that conversation? That's essentially what we do all the time. How does that mesh with the Supreme Court decision? I'm not sure. But Section 35 of our Constitution and a whole bunch of other really good laws require the government to meaningfully consult, and the Supreme Court has also ruled on that. That's why this permit got shot down, because they didn't meaningfully consult. And our challenge to the government is you keep pounding your fist on the table saying it's going to be built, it's going to be built, now you're going to go meaningfully consult. I don't know what you mean by that anymore. Yes?
One of the concerns I have about the tankers is ballast water. When they cross the ocean, empty, they put water
Yes, they do.
in the tanks. And then when they get to Vancouver, they don't put water out. Now, zebra mussels, what I've used is the Great Lakes right now, and they have been terrible. And these foreign ports are often very polluted. And that ballast water is going to be dumped here.
Right. So the concern raised is about the ballast water, sometimes called bilge water, that dumps out, that ships use to...
It's not bilge water,
Not,
it's ballast water.
oh, just the anchoring water.
They use to keep the tanker in the water,
When it's empty.
Water as it's crossing.
Right, so the ballast water, excuse me, not bilge water, which is another significant issue. What happens when these ships come in and do they introduce invasive species and other things from the water that they collected? I haven't seen that reviewed in the NEB report. Here's an interesting thing, is the NEB actually did look at oil tankers and the effect on orca whales. They did look at it. They commissioned research. And what they found was, because it's a species at risk population, there is no way to mitigate the damage against that population. That's in the NEB report. It was not included in the decision. Here's the bind for Trudeau. Is he sending the NEB back out to do environmental impacts? They've already done them, but they never included them. And the Species at Risk Act says, if you have a species at risk, you can't perform unmitigatable damage on them because you'll wipe them out. The ballast water, I haven't heard it raised, and I haven't heard it talked about in the NEB, but it's a good concern. Let's do a couple more.
Can I just interrupt?
Yes.
The International Maritime Organization actually has a convention on ballast water treatment. So when these tankers actually ballast down, before they get here, they actually have to reballast and exchange. So they're not coming in with, say, ballast water from Yokohama to here.
Oh, very good.
So they are exchanging it under.
I love the learning that goes on. Yes, right back.
Did you say that the best possible cleanup from an oil spill is 80%?
8. The question was, what's the best possible cleanup from an oil spill?
Because I thought it was like 10, 15%.
No, we worked with Berard Clean and a couple of the international companies when they were dealing with the Gulf spill. Valdez is a number of years ago, but similar. That if you get anything above a 2-foot swell or wave action of any kind, you've seen the skimmers and the buoys that they use. Anything that flushes over is now a problem, and even conventional oil will attach to particulate over time and then get under the skims, which only go down about 3 or 4 feet. So now 8% is considered a successful recovery. So if there's an oil spill somewhere and they say there was an oil spill in Indonesia and the booms are out and the recovery has been deemed successful, at best you're talking 8, 9, 10%. That's what they mean.
And also it hits that 8% of the room cleanup is...
That's right. Yeah, I had that standard Is your room clean? Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty clean. I can find a pathway through to my bed. That's clean. What do you want from me, Mom? That's basically the oil industry is a 12-year-old child when it comes to cleaning up. We'll take a couple more. Yes?
Nathan, thank you very much for all the information you presented to us. Does it currently stand that all our aids to fight this pipeline are just this petition, or do we have more in our aid?
No, yeah, there's more. So the question was, is this petition the whole eggs in all the basket game plan? No.
Tell me more.
Well, there's several. One is all the court cases that are going on, which will happen again. The process that Trudeau has now described, it's 22 weeks on the environmental review he's tacked on. On the Indigenous consultation side, he has given an undefined timeline. I think they're trying to punt it past the next election. Yeah, there is no deadline on the Indigenous consultation that we're aware of, that I've heard of. So there's the court, there's folks that choose to actively engage in protest. That happens right at the line itself when constructions are attempted.
There's no more protests going on because the construction's involved.
Right, when there's construction going on. The other is the political question. Here's the good thing, here's some good news. In the next federal election, which is a year from now, British Columbia is going to matter. Isn't that nice? There are some elections where you kind of get the feeling that we don't matter. Because it used to be Peter Mansbridge would come on the TV as we were headed out to the polling stations, and he would say, "We're now ready to declare a majority of a blah 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 government," and you go, "Oh, but I haven't voted yet, Peter. Could I have my vote first?" There is no path to power for any of the major parties that doesn't run through British Columbia. And it's a bit deja vu for me, is because the last time we did this campaign on Northern Gateway, it was the exact same math for Harper. That Harper needed British Columbia, and if pipelines could be an issue at the ballot box, pro or con, then his path back to a majority government was very difficult. And Harper knew it, because he told me he knew it. I assume Justin's people know it too. And so our relevance, not just in Vancouver Island, Duncan, and places, is to be able to reach out to friends and family. We're so connected now. And we share a lot of things. Cat videos, recipes, really important things. We also could maybe share the idea of having a better voice in this conversation. And my family from Alberta, a lot of friends from Alberta, I understand why they're so frustrated. I really do. Notley's doing her thing because that's what she was elected to do. And they were promised something. They were promised a pipeline with a good review process that was going to survive court. And we were promised a good review process that we could count on. And we were both lied to. And strangely, Trudeau has kind of unified us in a weird way. Not in a way that he ought to, but I understand and sympathize with where Alberta's feeling right now. And when I go in there and you say, you've got the fastest growing economy of any province, they're just not in that mood to talk. Because they feel like this is the last pipeline. All the other ones have been shot down. This is the last one. And they're desperate. There's a feeling of desperation. I'm going to go back and then across. Yes?
I was just wondering what the point of building the expansion is if most of the oil doesn't go to China and it just goes to the States. Like, why would they build a pipeline to the States rather than expansion?
So the question was, why go through all of this pipeline building and all the politics to do something we're already doing? We've asked the Prime Minister that question, and we've yet to hear the answer. It's an important question because it doesn't make sense. Why go through all this to do what you're already doing? That price gap that you're talking about is supposedly the argument. But again, back to what we're doing already, which is taking oil to the coast and getting the cheap price, sending it to San Diego. That's why we were asking for the contracts. Show us the Chinese and the Korean and the Japanese contracts that are all lining up for our oil, and they don't have them. So there isn't a company in the world that would spend $10 or $15 billion on a project without knowing they have a customer. There isn't a sane company on the planet that would do this. So we need to see some proof that this is even on the economic scale worth it. I saw one here, and then we'll go around, and then we'll do, I said 5 minutes. Okay, yes?
I was just wondering, have you ever considered having a job, like the Prime Minister's job?
Have I ever considered having a job? The first way you asked that question, I was like, yeah, I have considered it. I thought I should get a job at some point. The Prime Minister's job? No. No. No, but thank you for the compliment. No, I haven't. You know who tripped me once was this reporter. Oh gosh, I knew to forget his name. He's on Global. He's got a weekend show on Tom. He's got a weekend show. And Clark, thank you. Oh man, he's gonna be mad. Tom takes people up in his airplane and interviews them. It's the weirdest interview. You're sitting in this tiny little Cessna, and he flies around Ottawa. He's got these cameras on you, and he asks you questions. And Tom's trick is, he gives you the stick and says, "You want to fly?" Yeah. So we fly around, and he says, "Climb 1,000 feet. Now drop 1,000 feet." And so I'm concentrating, and while I'm doing that, he starts firing these questions at him. And he flew right over the Prime Minister's cottage. And he says, as we're dropping 1,000 feet, he says, "You ever want to go there?" And I said, "I don't know, it looks nice." And he says, "No, you ever want to be Prime Minister?" I said, "No, God, no." And he said, "Oh, no, you're just saying that." "No, I don't." "Yes."
So, sounds like TMP is going to be tied up a couple of years, next election.
Yeah.
NDP gets to be the ruling party.
Yeah. I like where you're going. Keep going. It's good.
What happens to the...
Oh, I think this thing is in a lot of trouble. Sometimes big resource projects die of old age. They're so badly thought of and designed that they're unsupportable through court, and no one will fund them. Usually private sector. Now we have public money, which makes this all weird. Oh, by the way, I would argue the government's in a conflict of interest. Because normally there's a proponent, and then there's a government assessing whether the proponent's telling the truth or not. Yeah, a little like the drug, but this is judge and jury time, which is also challengeable in court, by the way. We come in, we stop the bleeding. Stop. If we've allocated $10 to $15 billion on energy projects, okay. Any ideas? How about a home retrofit program? How about a heat exchange program? How about boosting up the electrical car capacity of it? We need dramatic, and I mean dramatic, bold action on the energy front. But for too long in Canada, we've kind of had it too good, and not too good, but just easy. And yeah, I think it's madness to keep doing this. It's just, what's the definition of insanity, right? Okay, the gentleman was, yes. Okay.
I'd like to just suggest Article 7 was to protect life in substances like asbestos, tobacco, noise, involving food, be lethal.
Right.
And are killing people. So how does our Prime Minister have the right to purchase a pipeline that kills people?
Okay. So the comment was on Article 7, which is right to life, and that there are substances we know to be lethal to humans. Asbestos, tobacco.
I'm a toxicologist, by the way. We discovered the dopamine receptor in the brain. Did the greatest mental health research in Canada and the world, by the Nobel Prize Committee in the year 2000. And I know what I'm talking about as far as the science goes, but they don't want to listen to the science. And Mr. Trudeau should account for that. And I'm tired of hearing about, well, you can vote your choice at the next election.
Right.
Because all politicians should be accountable for Article 7 legislation.
Very good.
Everything in our society is about protecting people.
Protecting life. Absolutely. I think that does a good response. The government came in very much on a promise of being different, being evidence-based, open and transparent by default. It's been a significant struggle for them to maintain that promise to this point. It is not evidence-based. Not economically evidence-based, environmental, or Indigenous rights and title, evidence-based. And they thought, going into that court case, they were going to win that because the evidence held up for them, even though we warned them and the evidence was strong the other way. Okay, just two more because we have to go.
How do you respond, because I hear it regularly, that engage people who are talking about the pipeline?
Yeah.
Stop it. They say, well, we don't build a pipeline, we can't send it by rail.
Okay, so the question is, how do you respond to folks who say, if you don't build a pipeline, we're just going to send it by rail? This is assuming, how long do you build a pipeline for? Minimum is 50 years, and they can extend life to 70, 80 years depending. Bitumen is tough on pipelines, by the way, dilute bitumen. It's more corrosive, it's hotter, it's under more pressure. Let's say 50 years just to be safe. What we're saying is we believe that the world will be consuming large amounts of oil in 2070. We will not be consuming large amounts of oil, shipping it all over the world in 2070, and still be here. Those two things become incompatible over time. Stephen Harper made a commitment to decarbonize Canada fully by 2100 at the OECD. It's just incongruent with the facts as we see them. So, to people who say, well, that's the inevitability argument. If you don't do this, we'll threaten you with lac mégantic. And I remember the oil industry getting up right after that tragedy in Quebec, when a train rolled down out of control and blew up half the town, and said, see, let us build your pipeline. My gosh, the ethics to go there. Last question. Yeah. Yeah, the refinery question comes up a lot. Why don't we refine this? Why don't we upgrade it? Why don't we create the jobs? There was a raging socialist in Alberta in the 70s, a guy named Peter Lougheed. Boy, that guy, Pinko, man. He said, well, we're not going to export natural gas raw out of Alberta. We ban it. Ban it! Because, he said, we will never create the secondary industries that come from doing something with it if it goes out raw. When we ask industry and when we ask the government, why don't you do something with this? They say, we are vertically integrated operations. We own the source, we own transport, and we own refineries, particularly in the Gulf Coast. And many of the Gulf Coast refineries were set up to deal with Venezuelan oil. Venezuelan oil is very akin to our oil in its heaviness. You can't flip a refinery from one kind of oil, a light sweet, to a heavy bitumen-based oil. Very difficult, and they don't want to do it. They basically have told us, time and again, we've had them at committee, we don't want to do it. They're expensive. A refinery and an upgrader, 15, 20, 25 billion, depending on size. And they already have equipment available. That's what they'd like to use instead.
Yeah, refineries, just think of this. Winnipeg shut down when other refineries shut down. People didn't write this down.
Right.
Now, they just shut down the one between Edmonton and Sherwood Park.
Yes.
Because Sherwood Park didn't write this down.
Yeah, refineries, no one wants to live near one. They make a pulp mill smell like flowers.
All the refineries, especially the one in Sherwood Park, was there before it became populated.
Yes.
They built those.
Which is sort of a secondary industry argument. Locating refineries is difficult. It's hard to find a town that's going to accept them. Maybe. So then what we become is a country that simply produces raw materials for the world. We send out our wood round, we send out our rocks unprocessed, and we send out our oil in its raw form. That's what Canada becomes. That is, by definition, economic suicide. If you just become the base material for the planet, there is no way to have what we have come to know as a middle class. There's just no way. Added value is what we talk about all the time. Rip and ship is what we do a lot more. And it's a frustrating problem for many of us. It's something that we do by policy. And we pretend it's just the natural forces of the world, and I disagree. So, all of this to be said. No? Okay. One last thing, because it's important. We're going to vote on a referendum coming up in, when is it? That's like a week, 2 weeks? Ballots go out October 20th, 2nd. Everyone know about this? Yeah. Oh, good. Awareness apparently is very low. I worked on electoral reform at the federal level. It's a really good idea. We should really think about it. The ballot will come with two questions. The first question, do you want to keep the current system we have, first past the post, or do you want to move to a proportional system? That's the first question. The second question is, of the three systems on offer, which one do you like best? Second best, third best. If the first one fails, if less than 50% of British Columbians say yes, the second answer becomes irrelevant. If the first question passes, the answer to the second question becomes the voting system the government must bring in through legislation. Proportional voting is voting systems used in many countries around the world, in fact most successful democracies, which tries to do the following radical thing. It tries to equate the popularity of a party in the vote to what they get in seats. I know, crazy making. If a party gets about 20% of the vote, they approximately get about 20% of the seats. First past the post doesn't always do that very well. In fact, usually doesn't. In our 150 odd years of history, we've had two true majority governments in which the majority government got a majority of the votes. Can anyone name them? Mulroney got one. Deacon Baker got the other one. What's that? Yeah. So the votes will come in. The three systems, you can read all of them. We won't get into them. There's dual member, there's a mixed member proportional, and you can really nerd out on all this stuff. And one's called rural-urban. All I'd say is inform yourselves as best as you can. Please vote. Talk to people about it, because this is not a top-of-mind issue for people. If you like the state of politics in the country, then vote for the status quo. If you like how your votes are counted or not counted and everything's awesome, then stay with what you know. If you think your vote should count, which in proportional systems it tends to, then consider change. This is what happens typically. A party gets 44 or 40% of the vote. They end up with slightly over 50, 60% of the seats. And with 60% of the seats in a parliamentary system, that means 100% of the power. We get elections like New Brunswick just had. Wrong winner elections. The Liberals got 39, 38% of the vote. The Tories got 31, 32. The Tories got one more seat. The CAQ, Coalition, something, just won in Quebec with 40% of the vote. Majority government, and are now ready and willing to bring in the notwithstanding clause to ban people and suspend our Charter of Rights in Quebec for the expression of religious values, which are a charter-protected right, except for the cross, they said, which is not a religious value, it's historic. I can't make it up. Doug Ford came in with 40% of the vote. Has similarly threatened to use the notwithstanding clause because he didn't like the Toronto City Council numbers. And Ford is going to use it again, he says. All I'd suggest to you is that the issues we were talking about here tonight, energy policy or housing or any of these things, the foundation of all of that is the expression of our democratic rights that were hard fought for. The current system we have was invented long before the light bulb and hasn't been updated since. And people who say that radical or difficult governments get in need to look south of the border. If you can, for a moment. And the greatest frustration, those of us that are in public life, standing on a doorstep with a voter, especially a young voter, and saying, are you ready to vote? And they say, it doesn't matter. My vote never counts. I live in such and such a riding. We never vote this way. Because voting is an irrational act of hope. We don't really have the expectation that our single vote is going to determine the election, do we? Although in BC, there was a town. But it's not our expectation. I believe our expectation should be that every vote counts. That whoever you like, upside down, sideways, pirate party, whatever, that there should be some possibility that your vote will be reflected in the legislature that is formed. That would be nice, because then it goes back to the accountability. Because it's hard to get a majority government without a majority of votes under proportional systems. And what I know is that there are 25 to 30 seats in this country that matter. There's probably 15 in BC that matter. Why do those few seats matter? Why are there so few that matter out of all the seats? So the question is, why do they get 3 different choices? They could have given just one choice, or they could have given no choices and just said a proportional system, and then the accusation would have been, Morgan's going to pick a system that works for him. It was a tough bind. They chose this one.
There's a presentation.
Oh yes, there's an event tomorrow night. Jean Crowder's, Sonia, Elizabeth May.
7 o'clock, Arbutus Ridge will be a great discussion.
7 o'clock, Arbutus Ridge, Jean and the Greens are going to be talking. Is that what we're highlighting it as? Jean and the Greens? They got a band and put together. This will be an excellent talk if you're really into this. I'm going to stop there and end with this. The fact that you came out tonight, the fact that you're willing to engage is an expression of hope. There are those of us that are battled away. The thing that is most discouraging is when people don't express concern. Because the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. It's okay to be ticked off sometimes. It's okay to fall in love sometimes. But when people become indifferent, when they disengage, that is truly despair. And you folks are engaged. You might be supportive, you might be upset, you're engaged. And your responsibility is to engage somebody who's not engaged, who has turned away, and say it doesn't matter. Because my sacred belief is it does matter. Because if we turn away, the decisions are still going to get made, but just not by us. Thanks very much for coming out.
So I just want to end, just a few words. Like, I know it can be tough to maintain that hope. Last week in Parliament, I was witness to one of the most vitriolic and hate-spewed debates I think I've ever seen in my short career. And that was the Conservatives' Opposition Day motion on Terry Lynn McClintock being moved to an Aboriginal healing lodge for her role in the brutal murder of Tori Stafford. And, I saw respected colleagues, conservatives, liberals, just hurling insults at each other, and one even flipped the bird at another. Like, that's the state it got into last week. And I just thought to myself, like, my God, all the problems our country is facing, they picked this issue to spend an entire day's worth of the House of Commons time to debate on. That's what we did. But, as Nathan said, like, you can't lose sight of that hope. Like, in my opinion, politics is an inherently optimistic exercise. I got into this because I believed that change is possible. When I was working for Jean, my biggest motivator is I've seen my fair share of despair. I did 7 years of casework sitting across the table from constituents who were on their last little bit of rope. People who were in tears saying, I don't know if I have enough money to put food on the table or pay the rent this month. That's the kind of despair I've seen. But, I took that, bottled it up inside, and I said, like, there's got to be a way to change the system. And, I've talked to my wife about this a lot of times, like, because this is a job that takes me away from my family a lot. And she says to me, like, you've got to show us that this is worth it, that what you're doing is worth it. Like, we don't see a lot of you, so show us that it's worth it. And for me, personally, it comes down to my kids. I've got twin 6-year-olds and a 1-year-old. And I feel like because I have this great responsibility, a privilege of representing you, being your voice. But really, it comes down to the end of the day when I look at my kids, and I know everyone here, you have your relatives, you have your kids, your granddaughters, your nieces, your nephews. It's about what kind of a world are we going to leave to them. And we have to start, as Nathan said, not looking at electoral cycles, not 4 years, but 40 years, 400 years. So Don't lose that hope. Don't lose that hope. Hang on to it. This is one way we can start changing the system. So talk to your friends, your neighbors. Let's start making the people who represent us, like me, accountable to you, so that our voices actually get heard.
If you want more information on proportional representation, there's a really good website, fairvotecanada.ca. And to continue to fight this pipeline, check out protecttheinlet.ca if you don't know about government.
So thank you. And so I'll end this by thanking you for being amazing constituents that you are. Thank you for coming out tonight. And I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Take care, everyone.